This decision was not made in a vacuum. It was the result of simultaneous and visibly contradictory signals coming from the same government on the same issue at the same moment. And understanding that contradiction is the only way to understand what is actually happening. On April 15, 2026, President Donald Trump publicly stated that Chinese President Xi Jinping would give him what he described as a big fat hug during an upcoming visit to Beijing. He framed their relationship as cooperative, specifically emphasizing that both leaders were working together smartly and very well on the Iran situation. He posed a rhetorical question: does this not beat fighting? That is the statement. It is clear, it is public, it is deliberate. Now place that statement next to the second fact. At the same time, United States intelligence assessments were continuing to conclude that China was preparing to deliver shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile systems to Iran within a matter of weeks. These are not symbolic transfers. These are battlefield-relevant systems with direct implications for military aircraft operating in contested airspace. And there is a third element, which is not speculative. Documentation published by the Financial Times shows that Iran has been operating a Chinese-launched military surveillance satellite. That satellite has been used to photograph and strike United States military bases during the ongoing war. So now we have three facts, all existing at the same time. First, a public message of warmth and cooperation between Washington and Beijing at the highest level. Second, intelligence indicating imminent Chinese weapons transfers to Iran. Third, documented use of Chinese-origin military technology in operations targeting American forces. Let me be precise about this. These are not different interpretations of the same event. These are three separate realities coexisting. And this is where the analysis has to be very careful, because the next step is where most people draw the wrong conclusion. The instinct is to treat this as inconsistency or even incoherence. But that assumes that all actors involved are operating within a single, unified framework of priorities. The evidence here suggests something else. President Trump acknowledged that China played a role in bringing Iran to the negotiating table for the first ceasefire agreement. He also stated that Xi Jinping would like to see the Middle East war come to an end. In this framing, Beijing is not a threat actor. It is a necessary diplomatic partner. At the same time, his own intelligence community is documenting Chinese military technology being used in ways that directly affect American personnel. Think carefully about what that means. The same country is being described in the same policy space as both a constructive diplomatic partner and a source of material support to an adversary. This is not rhetorical ambiguity. This is structural tension. And this is the part of the report that almost no one is explaining accurately. National security analysts have responded to this contradiction with pointed commentary. Their argument is direct. The president is publicly rewarding Beijing for behavior that his own government has privately identified as a serious threat to American military personnel. That is the criticism. But the criticism alone does not explain the structure. So we continue. There is another actor in this system. Pakistan's army chief is currently in Tehran, working to lay the groundwork for new peace negotiations. These negotiations, if they proceed, will again require Chinese diplomatic involvement to succeed. So now the structure becomes clearer. Washington is facing a situation in which it needs Beijing's cooperation to achieve a diplomatic outcome in Iran, specifically a ceasefire or negotiated settlement. At the exact same moment, it is confronting evidence that Beijing is supporting Iran in ways that affect the battlefield. This is not a contradiction that can be resolved rhetorically. It is a contradiction built into the situation itself. And this leads directly to the next critical development. A summit between President Trump and President Xi is scheduled for May in Beijing. Under normal conditions, such a summit would already carry weight. But these are not normal conditions. This meeting now sits at the intersection of multiple geopolitical tracks: the Iran war and its possible resolution, the Ukraine conflict and its connection to Russian oil prices, and the question of whether China's documented support for Iran will be publicly addressed or quietly set aside in exchange for cooperation on broader diplomatic goals. Let me restate that clearly. The same meeting is expected to address trade relations, Middle East conflict dynamics, and global energy considerations, all while one side is assessing the other as both partner and enabler of an adversary. This was not inevitable. It became likely through a series of specific decisions. And here is the pattern interrupt. Washington calls this cooperation. Some analysts call it contradiction. But neither label by itself explains the structure. What we are looking at is a situation where diplomatic necessity and strategic suspicion are operating at the same time, without resolution. And this is where the historical context becomes essential. For decades, major power relationships have often included elements of both competition and cooperation. That is not new. What is different here is the immediacy and intensity of the overlap. Cooperation is not happening in a separate domain from competition. It is happening in the same domain, on the same issue, with the same actors. That changes the calculation. There is a data point in this report that changes the structural picture entirely. We will get to it in the next report, but before we do, consider the core analytical question that emerges from the facts already established. If one actor is simultaneously viewed as essential for ending a conflict and responsible for enabling that conflict's continuation, how does decision-making proceed? Or more precisely, which of those roles takes priority when policy is actually implemented? Because the answer to that question determines not just the outcome of the upcoming summit, but the direction of the broader relationship. Cooperation without clarity produces its own form of risk. The events are clear. The statements are clear. The contradiction is clear. What is not yet clear is the underlying logic that allows all of this to exist at the same time. That is where we turn next. The contradiction is not accidental. It reflects two parallel strategic calculations, one in Washington, one in Beijing, that are internally coherent but externally incompatible when they interact in the same space. Let us begin with Washington's logic, because the sequence of decisions makes that logic visible. President Trump's public framing of China as a cooperative partner on Iran is not simply rhetorical. It aligns with a specific operational requirement. The United States needs China's influence to bring Iran into, and keep Iran within, a negotiation framework. This is not an abstract preference. It is tied to a concrete outcome, the ceasefire process. Trump himself acknowledged that China helped bring Iran to the negotiating table for the first ceasefire deal. That is a measurable diplomatic outcome. It establishes Beijing not as a peripheral actor, but as a central intermediary. Now consider the second layer. Pakistan's army chief is in Tehran, working to prepare the ground for new peace talks. These talks, according to the facts presented, would again require Chinese diplomatic involvement to succeed. That is not optional. That is structural. So Washington's position becomes clearer. It is not choosing between confronting China and cooperating with China. It is attempting to do both at the same time, because the immediate objective, a negotiated outcome in Iran, cannot be achieved without Beijing's participation. Let me be very precise about this. This is not about trust. It is about leverage. Washington is operating on the assumption that China has sufficient influence over Iran to shape its behavior in negotiations. That assumption is supported by the earlier ceasefire outcome. So the logic follows. Maintain a cooperative tone publicly in order to preserve that influence channel. Now, place that logic next to the intelligence assessments. United States intelligence is concluding that China is preparing to deliver shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile systems to Iran within weeks. At the same time, documented evidence shows that Iran is using a Chinese-launched surveillance satellite to photograph and strike American military bases. These are not marginal details. They directly affect the operational environment. So the question becomes unavoidable. Why maintain a cooperative public posture toward a country whose actions are being assessed as contributing to battlefield risk? And this is where the strategic logic reveals itself. Washington is prioritizing the diplomatic track over the confrontation track, at least in its public signaling, because the diplomatic track is seen as the pathway to ending the conflict. This does not mean the intelligence assessments are ignored. It means they are being managed within a broader framework where immediate diplomatic outcomes are given weight. And this is where most analysis stops, but it should not, because Beijing is making its own calculation at the same time. Now we turn to China's logic, as revealed by the same set of facts. China is described, in President Trump's own statement, as wanting to see the Middle East war end. That is the diplomatic posture. At the same time, China is assessed to be preparing weapons transfers to Iran and has already provided satellite capability that Iran is using in military operations. These two actions, diplomatic engagement and military support, are not contradictory from Beijing's perspective. They are part of a single strategic approach. To understand why Beijing made this decision, you have to understand the context. China's role here is not limited to mediation. It is also positioning itself within the conflict structure. By supporting Iran in specific ways, it maintains influence. By engaging diplomatically, it translates that influence into negotiating leverage. This is not what most people think it is. It is not a choice between peace and conflict. It is a strategy that operates across both simultaneously. And this is the pattern interrupt. Washington reads Chinese actions as potentially enabling an adversary. Beijing reads its own actions as maintaining influence over that adversary. Both readings follow internal logic. The problem is that both logics, running simultaneously, produce friction. Now we arrive at the data point that changes the structural picture. Iran has been operating a Chinese-launched military surveillance satellite to photograph and strike United States military bases during the war. Consider what that means in operational terms. This is not indirect support. This is not economic engagement. This is the integration of Chinese-origin technology into active military operations affecting American forces. That shifts the baseline, because now the relationship is not only about diplomacy or influence, it includes a direct link between Chinese systems and outcomes on the battlefield. Think carefully about what that does to decision-making in Washington. It creates a situation where the same actor is required for diplomatic progress and implicated in military risk. And this brings us back to the summit. The upcoming meeting in Beijing is now carrying weight across multiple domains. It is not limited to trade. It includes the Iran war endgame, the relationship between the Ukraine conflict and Russian oil prices, and the unresolved question of how, or whether, to address China's support for Iran. So both sides enter the meeting with layered objectives. Washington seeks cooperation on Iran while managing concerns about Chinese actions. Beijing maintains its role as a diplomatic intermediary while sustaining its position within the conflict structure. This is not a stable equilibrium, because each side's logic depends on a different interpretation of acceptable risk. Miscalculation requires no malice, only different risk thresholds. And this is where the structural consequence begins to emerge. If cooperation is pursued without resolving the underlying contradiction, that China is both a diplomatic partner and a source of military capability for Iran, then each step forward in negotiations carries an unresolved tension. That tension does not disappear, it accumulates. And the critical question becomes unavoidable. At what point does the accumulation of that tension force a choice between cooperation and confrontation? Or, to put it more precisely, how long can both strategic logics operate in parallel before they begin to directly interfere with each other's objectives? Because when that interference becomes unavoidable, the structure changes. And that is the point we have now reached. The structure of this situation is now visible. One side requires cooperation to achieve a diplomatic outcome. The same side is documenting actions by its partner that directly affect its military position. The partner, for its part, is operating across both domains, diplomacy and material support, without separating them. This is not a temporary imbalance. It is a structural configuration. Let me be precise about this. When a single actor is simultaneously indispensable to negotiation and implicated in the continuation of the conflict being negotiated, the system does not stabilize on its own. It creates a condition where every step toward resolution is tied to an unresolved contradiction. And this is where the analysis has to be very careful, because the instinct is to look for a decisive moment, a turning point where one path is chosen over the other. The evidence does not show that such a moment has occurred. Instead, what we see is continuation. President Trump's public statements indicate a willingness to maintain a cooperative framing with Xi Jinping. This includes describing their relationship in personal terms and emphasizing joint efforts on the Iran situation. At the same time, his administration is considering tariffs of up to 50% in response to alleged Chinese weapons transfers. So even within Washington's approach, there are parallel tracks. One track maintains diplomatic engagement and emphasizes partnership. The other signals economic pressure in response to security concerns. These tracks are not synchronized. They operate alongside each other, and this is the pattern. It is not unique to this moment. It appears whenever strategic necessity and strategic distrust coexist without resolution. Now consider the role of the upcoming summit in Beijing. This meeting is not simply an opportunity for dialogue. It has become a point where multiple unresolved issues intersect. The Iran war and its potential endgame depend, in part, on Chinese involvement. The Ukraine conflict and its connection to Russian oil prices introduce another layer of economic and geopolitical calculation. And within this same meeting, there is the question of whether China's documented support for Iran will be publicly addressed or quietly set aside. This last point is critical, because it reveals the structural choice embedded within the situation. If the issue is publicly addressed, it introduces friction into the diplomatic process. It challenges the cooperative framing and raises the cost of continued engagement. If the issue is not addressed, it preserves the diplomatic pathway, but leaves the underlying contradiction unresolved. This is not a question of preference. It is a question of sequencing and priority. Which objective is given immediate weight? Confronting the behavior or securing the cooperation? Think carefully about what that means, because whichever choice is made does not eliminate the other issue. It postpones it. And postponed structural tensions do not disappear. They return, often with greater intensity. This was not a surprise. The trajectory was visible. The decisions that produced it were made in sequence, each narrowing the available options. And this is where the broader implication becomes clear. The relationship between Washington and Beijing, at least in this instance, is not operating on a single axis. It is operating on multiple axes simultaneously: diplomatic, military, economic, without a unified framework to reconcile them. That creates a condition where actions in one domain affect outcomes in another, without coordination. Now consider the role of third parties. Pakistan is actively working to facilitate new peace talks in Tehran. These efforts depend on Chinese involvement. Iran is using Chinese origin technology in its military operations. The United States is assessing both of these realities while preparing for a high-level summit. So the structure extends beyond bilateral interaction. It includes regional actors whose positions are shaped by the same dynamics. And this is the structural pullback. When multiple actors depend on a single intermediary for diplomatic progress, while that intermediary is also engaged in the conflict environment, the system becomes tightly coupled. In tightly coupled systems, small decisions have amplified effects. A statement made in Washington affects perceptions in Beijing. A transfer assessed by intelligence affects calculations in Tehran. A diplomatic move in Pakistan influences the feasibility of negotiations. Each element is connected, and this is why the margin for error becomes very small. Not because any single decision is catastrophic, but because the accumulation of decisions creates a system where unintended consequences become more likely. Let me be very precise about this. The issue is not whether cooperation or confrontation is the correct approach. The issue is that both are being pursued simultaneously without resolving the contradiction between them. That is the structural condition. And this leads to the final analytical question, not about what should happen, but about what the evidence shows is happening. Is the current approach reducing the gap between strategic necessity and strategic distrust, or is it allowing that gap to persist? Because the answer to that question determines the trajectory. If the gap is reduced, the system stabilizes. If the gap persists, each new development adds pressure. Unresolved contradictions do not remain static, they compound. This is not a moment defined by a single decision or a single meeting. It is defined by a pattern, cooperation and competition operating in the same space on the same issue without alignment. And in such a pattern, the outcome is not determined by intent alone. It is determined by how long the system can sustain that contradiction before it forces a clearer choice.